Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Today we're going to take on one of the great conquerors in world history, and that is Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan was a boy who came from very humble beginnings from the area that is northern Mongolia, just south of China. And he came from very poor tribes. He was, however, born to an aristocratic father who actually had a lot of power in his tribe. And his father was poisoned when he was a young boy by a competing tribe. And that really changed his life forever because his father's tribe didn't want to follow him anymore. Back then, you followed the strong horse. And so his people abandoned him, abandoned his mother, abandoned his siblings. And they ended up growing in a very humble and poor way and having to live on any kind of animals or fish or other things they could get in a very squalor situation. So he came from this situation where it looked like he was going to be aristocracy, and he ends up growing up as a poor, humble, hardworking boy. And that really shaped him for later when he assembled and amassed this massive army that rolled over Asia and Europe. And one of the things we're going to look at today is how in the world did this boy coming from such humble beginnings, how was he able to put together this army that ended up creating the largest empire in world history, even larger than the Roman Empire? And so we're going to get into all those details tonight. One of the things to look at with him is he has a very complicated impact and legacy because his tactics were incredibly brutal at times. They say that he and his armies left 10 million dead in their way, along the way with all the hundreds of towns that they pillaged. So the tactics were particularly brutal. However, one of the things to say about Genghis Khan was when he did eventually get control of this empire and manage it and put administrative controls in place, there were a lot of benefits that came out of it, a lot of things that we still look at today as progress. Their government was particularly good at administering and managing the people. The government was actually very much for making sure the people had everything that they needed to survive and to prosper. In addition, they brought things to the world that we still live with today and enjoy, things like gunpowder, paper, and other inventions that were really important that we use today. The most important thing he left behind as a legacy was trading routes between Europe and Asia. Back then they called it the Silk Road, but really the trading routes were incredibly important. He was a big fan of capitalism. He was a big fan of trading between countries. He believed trading was the path to prosperity. And so even today we have trading routes that were established by the Mongols and by Genghis Khan, his sons and his grandsons. So we'll get into all those things and his complicated legacy, but of course, somebody who created this massive empire, we just had to study tonight. Let's go ahead and get into Genghis Khan. So Genghis Khan was the Mongol king and great conqueror. He was born in 1162 AD and died in 1227 AD, left behind, as I said before, the largest empire in human history to his sons and eventually to his grandsons who continue to carry on the tradition. You see some great pictures here of him as both king and as philosopher and as diplomat and as warrior. Some of the real famous pictures of him are as warrior because he was particularly effective on the battlefield. There are still many different aspects of his military strategy and tactics that militaries across the world study even today. Things like blitzkrieg that was used in World War II or that is used now with rapid response, rapid strike. Those are things he really believed in, that you strike quickly, you strike when the enemy doesn't know you're coming. You use tactics they've never seen before, feign and retreat. And you'll get into some of the really important tactics he brought to military strategy when we show you the second video tonight. So in terms of Genghis Khan, his early life, you can see some pictures there of what they think he looked like as a boy. He was born as Temüjin. That was his actual born name as a boy, Temüjin. And he was born into an aristocratic family, as we said. He was the son of Yesugei, who was a tribal leader. And so he was destined to have this kind of aristocratic upbringing. However, his father arranged for the marriage to Borte, who was a daughter of another influential Mongol leader. And before that marriage could be fully arranged, his father was poisoned by rivals, leaving Temujin an orphan child with his mother. His father's followers deserted the family, and Temujin, along with his mother and siblings, were abandoned by their clan and forced to survive by hunting and foraging for roots and rodents and fish. A conflict with his older half-brother later, Bektar, led to Bektar's death, the crime that was attributed to Temujin and his full brother. They were essentially tried for the murder of their half-brother Bektar. And as punishment for the killing of Bektar, Temujin was seized and enslaved by a rival clan for several years. So he was in captivity as a young boy. He endured this captivity until he found a chance to escape by exploiting a moment of distraction from his captors. And the legend is that he actually was so friendly with his captors that one of them took a particular liking to him, and he was able to talk him into letting him go. And he jumped on a horse and rode off, and the rest is history. His escape from captivity was the story of legend that passed down through the centuries and was told over and over. So we don't know what part of it is true, but certainly the fact that he escaped was very impactful for his legacy, as you can see. So in terms of Genghis Khan and his rise to power, after his escape from captivity, Temujin began gathering supporters and manpower and started putting coalitions together, steadily building his influence and strength through all the different Mongol tribes. He skillfully formed alliances with the leaders of other tribes, a crucial step in consolidating his power on the vast steppes of Mongolia. By 1206, through a combination of warfare and diplomacy, Temujin had successfully united the scattered Mongol tribes under his banner, which led to his proclamation as Genghis Khan. And we'll talk a little bit later about what Khan means in the Mongolian language, but it essentially was supreme leader. With powerful allies and a force of his own, Temujin routed the Merkit with the help of his strategy, by which Temujin was regularly to scotch the seeds of future rebellion. He tried never to leave an enemy in his rear. Years later, before attacking China, he would make sure that no nomad leader survived to stab him in the back. So what he would do is he would make sure if he had any rivals at all within his midst, he got rid of them. He either killed them or he sent them off and banished them. And it was very brutal, but back then it was very important that the strong horse always survive. Not long after the destruction of the Merkit, he treated the nobility of the Jurchen clan in the same way. These princes, supposedly his allies, had profited by his absence on a raid against the Tatars to plunder the property. Temujin exterminated the clan nobility and took the common people as his own soldiers and slaves. And so you can see the way that he treated people if they tried to challenge his power, is he would just get rid of them or he would enslave them. So very brutal tactics by Genghis. In terms of his family life, around 14, Temujin married Borte, who was promised to him when he was a young child. It was his first and principal wife and a strategic alliance. His marriage to Borte, his first and most influential wife, was a strategic alliance that solidified his power, and their four well-known sons, Jaki, Chetakai, Agadai, and Tulu, formed the imperial lineage. They also had 5 daughters as well. Borte played a vital role in managing the empire, and the family's elevated status and influence was central to the long-term rule of the Mongol Empire through the Ching-Sed principle. Borte held considerable influence, advised Genghis Khan on political matters, and even ruled her own territory within the empire. The Ching-Sed principle dictated that only descendants of Genghis Khan and his first wife Borte could legitimately rule. So you can see the two of these together were a political dynasty and worked together very powerfully to manage this huge empire. When Genghis was away conquering a different area for the empire, Borte was very much on the throne and very much in control, and her orders ruled. So she was very much the queen of this empire. In terms of Genghis Khan's political career, Genghis was not for democracy, as you can imagine, but neither had he any strong race or class feelings and employed talent wherever he could find it. He was very much for a meritocracy. He was for the best people to surface. It didn't matter their race, creed, color, or even their sex. Within Mongolia, his role was progressive in that it unified the country and brought to his people the art of writing and education and new and better institutions. So, as we said before, although he was incredibly brutal on the battlefield and to his enemies, at home, he was actually a very good administrator and brought a lot of great reforms to his society. He believed in a strong society with justice and drew upon his humble beginnings, which allowed him to relate to the common man and the soldier. And then apparently, through the writings, he used to walk around and just have a beer or eat with his soldiers. He could just relate to the common person because he was one of them. However, he was particularly brutal at times, especially when you wronged him or a family member. Then justice went out the window and he acted very autocratic. He believed strongly in Mongol power and had a goal to dominate the entire known world. He wanted to bring Mongol traditions to all tribes of people that they encountered. Defeating the tribes in China were the primary goal he had for his expansionist tendencies, and he did so. And that took him many, many years, but he finally was able to subdue China underneath the Mongolian Empire. So Genghis was the first Khan. Genghis Khan was the founder and the first ruler, or the Khan, of the Mongol Empire, which he established in 1206 after uniting the nomadic Mongol tribes under his leadership. He acquired the title of Genghis Khan and dropped his birth name at a council of chiefs as the largest honor in the Mongol culture. Khan means universal ruler and had absolute power, similar to a king for life, with the power passing down to male heirs. Under his rule, he launched military campaigns that led to the creation of a vast empire that connected the East and the West and laid the foundation for the Mongol Empire under his descendants, his children and his grandchildren. He was the first and only ruler of the unified Mongol nation and the founder of an empire that would grow into one of the largest in history under his successors. So you can see the legacy that he left behind was this great Mongol Empire. So Genghis Khan, in expanding his empire, you can see there on the map in 1279, this is many years later, under his sons and grandsons, how large this empire got. It essentially took up all of Asia, most of the Middle East, and all of Eastern Europe. That's how large this empire got. Genghis Khan expanded his empire by first uniting Mongol tribes, creating a unified and disciplined military force, and recruiting all able-bodied men available in all of Mongolia. He then launched campaigns of conquest, conquering northern China, Central Asia by overthrowing the Khwarezmian Empire, and then pushing into Eastern Europe. His success was due to his strategic military brilliance, the adoption of siege warfare, and the unification of nomadic tribes into a powerful, disciplined army that ultimately established the largest contiguous land empire in history. Everywhere Genghis Khan and his Mongol armies conquered, they picked up large numbers of soldiers from their conquered tribes and assimilated them quickly into their fighting force. The empire in 1279 consisted of more square miles than the Roman Empire and was the largest empire ever assembled in world history. So this is pretty impressive if you think about what Genghis was able to pull off. This poor boy from Mongolia, and he was able to do this kind of action within himself, his sons, and his grandsons, and pull this off, essentially larger than the Roman Empire. Really very impressive for one leader. So Genghis Khan, his rivalry with China, Genghis Khan and his successors engaged in prolonged conflict with various Chinese dynasties, given by ambition for conquest and avenging his ancestors' deaths, particularly the torture and death of his great-grandfather by the Jin dynasty. He never forgot that. He always thought about his great-grandfather and what happened to him at the hands of the Chinese. Genghis Khan launched invasions against the Jin dynasty, capturing their capital in 1215. He also conducted a campaign against the Tangut kingdom of Xia, a northwestern border state of China, forcing their submission. While preparing for more systematic conquest of China, Genghis Khan was diverted to conquer the Khwarezmian Empire, as we mentioned earlier, where he earned a reputation for ruthlessness. This rivalry led to a series of campaigns against the Jin Empire in northern China, with the Mongols eventually absorbing the state under Genghis Khan's successor, Ögedei Khan, which was one of his sons. The later conquest of the southern Song dynasty by Genghis Khan's grandson, Kublai Khan, culminated in the establishment of the foreign Yuan dynasty and the complete subjugation of all of China. This marked the first time all of China was under the rule of a foreign power with Mongols at the helm. And what's really interesting is the Great Wall of China was already in place before Genghis Khan came along, and it did not stop he or his successors from conquering all of China. The Great Wall of China was breached. It's really fascinating if you think about this rivalry the Mongols had with China and eventually subjugated the entire country as part of their large empire. So Genghis Khan, in terms of his military tactics, probably the most famous thing he's known for. Mongol armies were primarily composed of skilled horsemen or cavalry, allowing for rapid movements across vast distances and swift attacks. The formidable horse archers could shoot accurately from horseback, enabling coordinated volleys of arrows to weaken enemy lines before engaging in close combat. Troops would simulate a panicked flight to lure enemies into pursuit, only to turn and launch a devastating counterattack, often to encircle their overconfident pursuers. Genghis Khan employed tactics to instill fear and confusion, such as using spies to spread misinformation and creating a war of nerves to demoralize opponents before an invasion. Extensive networks of spies and scouts provided detailed information on enemy strengths, weaknesses, and terrain, allowing for well-planned campaigns. To overcome fortified cities, the Mongols adopted siege engines like catapults and rockets, and even gunpowder weapons, often utilizing captured engineers and local experts to siege those cities. You can see a picture there on the bottom right of some of those siege weapons that the Mongols really perfected. Strict discipline and clear chain of command enabled coordinated maneuvers and rapid responses on the battlefield, with efficient communication via couriers and signals being used. The Mongols adapted their tactics to different terrains and opponents, demonstrating a remarkable ability to change their approach as needed to achieve victory. So this was really an incredibly impressive army that Genghis Khan put together and that was carried on after he died. And they used these tactics for, as you see, many centuries to create the largest empire in history. In terms of Genghis Khan and his impact and significance, his impact was dual legacy of brutal conquest and lasting global connection as he unified Mongol tribes to create the largest contiguous land empire in history, leading to widespread destruction, but also unprecedented cross-continental trade and cultural exchange under the Pax Mongolica. His conquests involved immense bloodshed, destruction, and devastation, particularly through the destruction of entire cities and settlements. And as I said before, they think that as many as 10 million died at he and his troops' hands. The widespread depopulation during his conquest led to significant reforestation and measurable cooling effect of the Earth's climate at that time, though this was unintended. His administrative innovations, meritocracy, a promotion of free trade, and secular governance facilitated the spread of technologies like paper and gunpowder, the establishment of diplomatic immunity, and the creation of unified Eurasian cultural systems that influenced the modern world. His major positive legacy was the establishment for all time of trade routes that last even today between Europe and Asia. So you can see there's always the good and the bad in these very brutal dictators, but there was quite a bit of good that came out of the Mongol Empire that we're still enjoying today, especially around trade and diplomacy. So I think that gives you a really good sense for Genghis Khan, the man, the general, the Khan or the leader of this vast empire that ended up taking over all of Asia, the Middle East, and some of Europe, and really was quite remarkable from this boy that came up from very humble beginnings. Let's go ahead and we're going to take a look at two short videos. One is a brief bio of Genghis Khan, and the second one is one that talks about the military tactics that he was the strategist for. And they're really interesting to see how the Mongols were able to conquer all these different tribes all across Asia and Europe.
In the year 1162, between modern-day Mongolia and Siberia, a ruthless leader and great conqueror was born. The King of Kings, a brutal barbarian and the founder of the largest connected land empire the world has ever seen. His name? Genghis Khan. Genghis, together with his sons and grandsons, went to war on an immense scale, and in only 25 years, the Mongol army conquered more territory than the Romans had done in 400. By the time of his death in 1227, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Caspian Sea. Encompassing around 10 million square miles, the empire was vast, measuring the same size as the African continent and larger than the United States, Canada, Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean islands combined, making Genghis Khan one of the most successful military commanders the world has ever known. Born in 1162 to the name Temüjin, he was the son of a local chieftain and was said to have been born clutching a blood clot, a sign from heaven that he would become a great warrior. Temüjin experienced grief and suffering from an early age, with his father being poisoned by a rival tribe when he was only 9 years old. After his father's death, the tribe abandoned Temüjin and his family, as Mongol tribes would only follow a strong and respected leader, forcing them to survive in the harsh conditions of the steppes by themselves. It was during this time that Temüjin killed his half-brother, who had been accused of hoarding food while others starved. This allowed Temüjin to gain control over the tribe, and soon he was leading it alongside his lifelong friend and blood brother, Jumuka. 10 years later, Temüjin understood that his small tribe in the open grasslands of the steppes was weak and exposed, so he sought to bolster his numbers by marrying into a local tribe. He soon found Borte, his first wife. Not only did Temüjin gain a loving companion, but more importantly, the fighting force that came with her. Temüjin was not fated to have a peaceful life, as it would not be long until adversity returned to him. The powerful Merkit tribe came and raided his camp, killing many and stealing Borte away. Temüjin and Jumuka managed to escape and made their way to the local Khan, who had fought aside Temüjin's father, begging for help. The Khan accepted their plea, and soon Temüjin was at the head of a massive fighting force. Shortly after, he took swift and decisive action against those who wronged him. Heading to the Merkit camp in the mountains of northern Mongolia, he slaughtered the offending tribe, taking his wife back in the process. These cruel conditions Temüjin faced in his earlier years helped shape him into the fierce warlord he was to become, and taught him not only how to deal with his enemies, but also the value of forging friendships and alliances. As time progressed, the tribe became divided, as the fundamental differences between the two leaders became apparent. Temüjin valued talent wherever it came from, whereas Jumuka thought only those who had a noble birth should be respected. This led to a rift in the tribe and an eventual split, with Jumuka now leading a clan of his own. It would be 2 years until the pair would meet again, in which Jumuka's men slaughtered Temüjin's unprepared and outnumbered tribe. The generals Jumuka captured also faced a gruesome death, being boiled alive. When Temüjin found out what had happened, he was furious, and it said from that day on he would seek revenge and pledge never to be defeated again. In 1204, the two finally fought each other in a pitched battle, which would be crucial for the survival of the Mongol people and would determine Temüjin's position as commander. Tribesmen were trained in both archery and horsemanship, and when the battle began, they used this to deadly effect. Bows were made from wood and animal bone and had a shooting range of 500 yards. The military ranking was also based on the idea of meritocracy, so it was in this battle that Temüjin proved his military genius. He told each warrior to light 5 fires on the eve of the battle, so Jumuka scouts would report an immense fighting force, striking fear into the heart of the enemy. As dawn broke, both armies advanced, and when close enough, Temüjin's forces unleashed a barrage of arrows and used cavalry charges to demolish Jumuka's army. He then feigned retreat with some of his squadrons, luring his foe into a planned ambush where they were promptly slaughtered. This led to a decisive victory over his former blood brother, who fled from the battle. Jumuka was later betrayed by 2 of his generals and brought before Temüjin. When he refused the second chance Temüjin offered him, he was given an honourable death, and finally the Mongols were unified under one leader. To honour this great achievement, Temüjin was granted the title of Genghis Khan in 1206, meaning universal leader. Genghis Khan soon turned his attention to the vast Chinese dynasties in the east. He knew the emperor would never allow such a strong and unified Mongolia on his borders, and so decided to take the first strike. Heading into China, the Khan's army plundered, raped and killed any who stood in their way until they reached the capital of the north, Zhongdu, now called Beijing. The city was one of the most advanced in the world, sporting 40-foot high walls that were completely alien to the nomadic Mongols. To get into the city, Genghis Khan used captured Chinese engineers to design siege equipment and camped outside the walls, cutting off vital supply lines. This lasted for so long that the Chinese began to starve to death by the thousands, many turning to cannibalism. When the Mongols went to take the city, they met reduced resistance and were able to take it with relative ease. This led to a month of plunder and destruction that enhanced Genghis Khan's reputation as a bloodthirsty murderer and brought the Mongol Empire to new heights. His army continued west after the conquest, managing to reach Eastern Europe, showing little sign of slowing down. Genghis Khan died in 1227 during his final conquest into China. According to the secret history, his last words were, "I have conquered for you a large empire, but my life was too short to take the whole world. That I leave to you." He appointed his son Ögedei as his successor, in the hopes that he could complete the divine mission. Genghis Khan was buried in an unmarked grave, with all those who arranged the funeral apparently executed in order to keep the location a secret. Genghis Khan left a remarkable legacy, not only in blood and warfare, but also in his descendants. As he took the most beautiful women as prizes from every conquest, naturally he had many children. So many, in fact, that recent studies suggest that 1 in every 200 people living today are directly descended from him. Under Genghis Khan's rule, there also developed a complex and sophisticated society, which paved the way for modern-day civilization. The Mongols disregarded race, ethnicity, and class, creating a society based on meritocracy, where individuals were rewarded on ability and talent above all other things. They also practiced religious tolerance, allowing the Mongol Empire to become one of the most diverse in history. In an attempt to unify the feuding tribes of Mongolia, Genghis Khan gave land to each tribe and established a legal system where he laid out uniform punishments so as to create a combined society that abided by the same laws. He also forbade the enslavement of any Mongol, helping to solidify equality for all citizens. He also offered protection for the merchants travelling across his empire, leading to the re-establishment of the legendary Silk Road that enabled the transportation of goods and technology from east to west. This path was so valued and well protected, it was said that a man could walk from one end of the Mongol Empire to the other with a gold plate on his head and never be attacked. This also enabled the spread of Chinese culture and ideas to the growing civilizations in Europe. Trade surged and new technology such as paper, gunpowder and the compass made its way to the West, igniting the Renaissance just a few generations later. While there is no doubt that Genghis Khan was a cunning and ruthless warlord, it is debatable whether he was just an evil barbarian or managed to benefit the world in some way. While there is truth to the idea that he was a genocidal maniac, he also created a diverse and equal society under which the trade of both technology and culture flourished. In this way, Genghis Khan started an empire that had a wide and long-lasting impact on civilization in both the East and the West, the repercussions of which can still be felt today.
For millennia, the nomadic horse archers of the Great Eurasian Steppe were among the most fearsome foes an army could face in open battle, and the 13th century Mongols were no exception. We will examine the tactics of pitched battle that made the Mongols the dominant military power of the world for a century. The strength of the Mongol army rested on the same skill sets of all steppe nomads: mobility and deadly long-range firepower. Doctrine for all horse archers was simple: to maximize damage to the enemy from as far away as possible for as long as possible, only closing once they had been sufficiently demoralized, their formations broken by an unceasing rain of arrows, or tricked into leaving their lines in an effort to pursue the horsemen. The Mongols did not invent these techniques, but they did apply them at a scale beyond the mightiest of previous steppe empires, adapting them as necessary for a variety of situations. Mongolian and steppe nomadic army tactics evolved out of the routines of daily life. Each warrior on horseback had several remounts, armed with 2 or more bows and several quivers of arrows. This was the bare minimum to be a combatant, and effective enough for most situations. Riding a horse from their earliest years and learning to draw and hunt with a bow from almost as early, by adulthood, every Mongol had a lifetime of experience shooting from horseback. Nearly every medieval writer comments on the Mongols' ensuing hardiness and stamina. The Mongols were able to endure hardship that made the armies of the sedentary world buckle. Peerless archers and expert riders, any commander would be a fool to not take advantage of such an army. The Mongol army was not trained as much as it was grown. The basic tactics evolved out of two tools: excellent bows and a massive supply of horses. Every Mongol was armed with a composite recurve bow, which they made themselves. Incredibly powerful, these bows could send arrows immense distances. One stone inscription from early 13th century Mongolia records that Genghis Khan's nephew, Yesugei, sent an arrow almost 530 meters. This was likely a specially made light arrow designed for distance, and lacked any meaningful penetrative power at that range. Actual effective combat range is debated. Historian Timothy May suggests it was anything under 170 meters, while John Masson Smith Jr. puts 30 meters as the optimum distance to maximize accuracy and penetration. Regardless of the range, medieval authors consistently describe the Mongols as frighteningly accurate with their bows. In the Caucasus, where contact was easily made with several Turkic peoples proficient in horse archery, one Armenian chronicler specifically designated the Mongols as the nation of archers. Alongside the power of their bows, the horse was the other vital component of Mongolian tactics. Every nomad of the Great Eurasian Steppe rode a horse, where vast grasslands provided the ideal environment for rearing them. The Mongol horse is smaller than those of sedentary regions, weighing under 300 kilograms and rarely more than 14 hands or 142 centimeters high at the withers, the shoulders. Unlike the grain and fodder-fed horses of China, Europe, or the Islamic world, the Mongolian horses lived almost exclusively off the abundant grasses of the steppe. So prime is this grassland that even today, Mongolia's horses outnumber the country's humans and account for over 6% of the world's horse population. When on campaign, each rider brought 5 or more horses with him, riding one a day and letting it rest for the following days while he rode the others. Like their riders, the Mongolian horses were hardy, surviving in conditions deadly for larger breeds. Sure-footed, well-trained and obedient, though not the fastest, the Mongolian horse was a reliable platform for battle. Campaigning and entering battle with strings of remounts provided the Mongols strategic opportunities unavailable to their enemies. This proficiency with a bow and easy access to great quantities of horses were the building blocks of the Mongols' deadliness in battle. Usually facing off against armies that could not amass any comparative number of horses or skilled bowmen, the Mongols enjoyed far greater striking power and mobility, their tactics maximizing this advantage and minimizing the need for prolonged close-quarter contact with the enemy. Perhaps the most recognizable manifestation of this was the caracole, what historian Timothy May believes is meant by the Shi-Uchi chisel attack mentioned in the Secret History of the Mongols. Waves of Mongols, organized in their decimal units, Arban, Jagan, or even Mingan, would ride towards the enemy, shooting arrows as they approached. At a set distance, perhaps the 30 meters or less suggested by John Masson Smith, the wave would pull away. As this wave fell back, the riders would turn in the saddle and fire backwards, the famous Parthian shot. With one wave falling back out of range and to safety to rest men and grab remounts, another wave advanced and carried out the same process, resulting in a continuous barrage of arrows. To do this successfully is tremendously difficult. It requires extensive training to not result in hundreds of men and horses crashing into each other or sending arrows into each other's backs. In order to function smoothly, each wave needs to know when the other wave is advancing or falling back and move accordingly, so as not to obstruct the forthcoming waves. When operating effectively, it was extraordinarily effective. For those subject to the Mongol caracole, it was an immense psychological attack alongside the storm of arrows. By nature, humans do not generally enjoy having large groups of horses run towards them. Having it occur repeatedly brings on the additional anxiety of not knowing which wave might not turn away, but ride directly into their lines. All the while, arrows with shocking accuracy and power pick away at the other men in the line, whittling down both numbers and resolve. To someone on foot, the successive waves of horsemen would be impossible to count, appearing endless. Even well-trained men would struggle to fight their instincts to flee or charge out at the enemy in anger, both options aligning exactly with Mongol desires. If the enemy began to rout under the arrow fire, then instead of pulling back, one wave would instead charge into the enemy, falling upon fleeing men and taking advantage of the opening in the line. An enemy army in the midst of flight would be unable to resist, allowing the Mongols to ride them down much easier. If instead the enemy, especially proud cavalrymen, attempted to charge the Mongol caracol, then this allowed the Mongols to employ the favourite ploy of all steppe warriors, the feigned retreat. A feigned retreat is easy enough on paper, but difficult to execute in practice. When an enemy ran after the Mongols would appear to flee, panicked by the charge of the very brave and well-armoured enemy horsemen. There was a real danger of the feigned rout turning into a real one if the enemy horsemen reached the Mongols. Their often superior armour and training would allow them to wreak havoc on more lightly armoured Mongols. If orchestrated properly, however, the fleeing Mongols took their pursuers to ground of their choosing, where other Mongol units waited in preparation. Archers picked off the isolated enemy, and heavy cavalry delivered the final blow to the stragglers. If this had been all the enemy cavalry, the Mongols could then easily surround these surviving infantry and pick them off at their leisure. The feigned retreat was employed again and again across Eurasia. Against fortresses, where garrisons were tricked into coming out from their walls to chase fleeing nomads, to epic 9-day pursuits. The most famous was that which Subutai employed against the Rus and Kipchak at the Khalkha River. Perhaps not quite the master plan it is often presented as, Subutai may have been genuinely fleeing before the Rus and Kipchak following the death of his friend and mentor Jebe while scouting the enemy army, as suggested in a recent article by historian Stefan Pau. Pursued across the steppe, Subutai saw the enemy formation lose structure, the faster Kuman Kipchaks gaining ahead of their Rus allies. Turning back to face them, on the Khalkha River, Subutai brought the full might of his army against only a portion of the enemy. First, the Kipchak, who broke and ran into the oncoming Rus. With their advance halted, Mongol arrows now fell upon them. Order was lost, the Rus began to flee, and Subutai carried the day, annihilating the enemy army. In the event that the enemy did not pursue or rout, but instead held their position in orderly formation, the Mongols had another option, simply moving on. More mobile than their enemies, and always fighting in enemy territory, the Mongols could pull away and ravage the surrounding countryside, disheartening the enemy army by slaughtering the local population, filling the sky with the smoke of burning homes, or cutting off enemy access to water or resources. Defections and panic set in as refugees fled to the army with stories of Mongol brutality. A stationary foe, or one holding up in a wagon fort as the Hungarians did at Mohi in 1242, was soon trapped in a nege, a Mongolian hunting circle. Cordoning off the area, the Mongols would surround and gradually close in on the foe, cutting off avenues of escape and driving panicked villagers towards the target. At the strategic level, or while hunting, strict orders allowed nothing to leave the circle alive. But on the tactical level, the nege had a devious trick. A gap would be left in the steadily closing circle, apparently overlooked by the overeager Mongols. To those on foot, it seemed a silver lining. The Mongols understood the psychology of men and animals. When cornered with nowhere to run, they fight to the death. Provided a means to see another day, either tiger or man will seize the chance to live. And by doing so, they did exactly what the Mongols wanted. At Mohi, when the Hungarians fled through the gap in the line, the Mongols formed up beside the fleeing enemy, whose formation and sense to resist was long since abandoned. Once the foe was suitably bedraggled and exhausted, only then did the Mongols fall upon them, minimizing harm to themselves, but ensuring few, if any, escaped their clutches. Contrary to some depictions, heavy cavalry was used by the Mongols, though Asian cavalry differed from the heavy shock lances imagined in Europe when the term is mentioned. For the Mongols, their own heavy armored cavalry was a minority, more usually utilizing subject peoples in this role. For the majority of Asian heavy cavalry, from China, Iran and the Turkic and Mongolian tribes of Central Asia, the primary weapon of heavy cavalry was still the bow, even when both horse and rider were fully armored. In the steppe, heavy armor was harder to procure with limited access to smiths and raw materials. The more common armor varieties reflected this, created from materials the Mongols had ready access to, felt and leather. Perhaps the most well-known was the hatanga del, a sort of thick, gambeson-like coat of thickly layered felt. Increasingly over the 13th century, the hatanga was secured with metal plates within it for a brigandine. For man and horse protection, lamina was favoured, long layered bands of leather laced together. The most expensive was lamella, consisting of individual metal plates sewn together in rows. Flexible, the armour was designed to fold over the legs while on horseback, though the arms and hands were left exposed to not encumber usage of the bow. The Mongols considered lamella better protection against arrows than mail, as well as easier for nomads to both produce and maintain. Mongolian heavy cavalry was intended to be a decisive finishing blow against enemies weakened by arrow fire or drawn into feigned retreats, rather than engage in any sort of prolonged melee. With their smaller horses, the Mongols had to be careful to not overexert the animals, especially when fully armoured, and heavy cavalry charges were likely limited affairs in the early days of the conquests. As more subject peoples were added to the Mongol army, their own heavy cavalry would take on these vulnerable close-quarter roles, leaving the valuable Mongolian and Turkic horse archers safe to pick off the enemy from a distance. While fighting in China, Khitan, Jurchen and Tangut heavy cavalry were regularly employed by the Mongols, while in the Ilkhanate, Armenian and Georgian heavy cavalry were at the forefront of the Mongol wars in the region, particularly against the Mamluks. For extraordinary situations, the Mongols applied unorthodox tactics. At Mohi in 1241, the initial effort to storm the bridge was accompanied by Subutai attempting to build a bridge further downriver in an effort to flank the Hungarian army. When the Hungarians successfully resisted an attempt to force the bridge, the Mongols pulled back and early the following morning brought up catapults and shelled the guards left on the Hungarian side of the bridge. This was quickly followed up by a cavalry charge. The bridge over the Sayo River was taken and the Hungarian camp encircled. While fighting off a Burmese invasion into Mongol-controlled Yunnan in 1277, the sight and scent of the Burmese elephants frightened the Mongol horses. The Mongol commander quickly ordered his men to the tree line to tie them to the tree trunks. Dismounted, the Mongols advanced on foot and sent volleys of arrows into the elephants. Under the incessant barrage, the elephants panicked, crashing through the Burmese lines before leaving the battlefield. While part of the Mongol force continued providing covering fire, detachments filed back to the trees to remount their horses, continuing in this order until they were all on horseback. Where the Mongols' tactical ability failed them was in environments too unsuited to cavalry maneuvers, the humid jungles of southeastern Asia perhaps the greatest example of this. The conquest of the Song dynasty was only completed with the massive conscription of Chinese soldiers and creation of a fleet to challenge the Song on the vital rivers of South China. In Syria, historians like John Masson Smith have argued the region lacked the pasture capacity to provide for the vast horse herds the Mongols liked to bring with them, forcing them to advance with smaller forces the Mamluks could overcome. In straight tactical engagements, the Mongols performed their poorest against those who fought in similar fashion to themselves. Genghis Khan's only defeats were against other tribes of the Mongolian steppe, and it seemed he considered the nomadic Turks of the Western steppe, the Kuman Kipchaks, to be the single greatest foe against Mongol expansion. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and the Sultanate of Delhi both employed Turkic horse archers, often Kuman Kipchaks bought as slaves, to great effect against the Mongols. Essentially, these were armies which could recognize feigned retreats and nomadic ploys and force the Mongols into engagements which minimized their superiority in horse numbers.
That gives you a really good sense of the life of Genghis Khan growing up as a very young and poor boy who had his father poisoned at a very young age, ends up growing up and finding a way to unite the Mongol tribes all together under one flag, which was his, marrying into a politically powerful family, having many sons and daughters and grandchildren who could carry on his legacy. And then, as you see, used particularly brutal tactics on the battlefield, and in some ways, really brilliant tactics. If you think about the way that they were able to do warfare in a very fast, effective way, using all kinds of different tactics, the feigned retreats, the arrows from all different angles, the very fast cavalry, smaller horses, the siege weapons that they learned how to use when they got to very tall walls that they had to breach. So this was a very interesting life that Genghis Khan led. Obviously committed many atrocities to put together the empire that he put together, he and his successors, but also left behind a lot of improvements to society that we still enjoy today. And so it really is a complicated legacy that he had. Hopefully you enjoyed learning a little bit about Genghis Khan, about what he was able to achieve in his life, and the positive and the negative aspects of his legacy that we need to recognize. The power that he was able to display and the amount of territory he was able to conquer from a very small area of Mongolia really was incredible, if you think about it. And so the history is fascinating, and hopefully you want to dig a little bit more into Genghis Khan, learning about this Mongol king, the good and the bad that he was able to achieve, and some of the legacies we're still dealing with today and that we're able to enjoy. Especially global trade, I believe, was largely benefited tremendously by his improvement of the Silk Road. So thank you so much for listening tonight. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel, and we will see you on another episode of Traveling Through History. Hopefully you love history as much as we do. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.